Okay, we are on Vav base. We are on not Vav, sorry, 3B, Gimel base. And the Gemara is discussing a case that a guy on Shabbat, if he put his hand outside with some fruit, he put his hand, extended his hand from private to public. And now the question is, can he bring his hand back in? That's the Gemara's question. So the Gemara brought two brisos. One brisa says he could put his hand back in, and one brisa says he can't put his hand back in. And the Gemara said that are they arguing? It seems like the two brisos are arguing, right? One says you can put it back in, one says you can't put it back in. And the Gemara says they're not arguing. The Gemara says up to the case, one opinion is one person put his hand out intentionally and one person put his hand out unintentionally. And the Gemara says, if the guy who puts his hand out intentionally, we're going to give him a fine and we're not going to allow him to bring his hand back. However, the guy who put his hand out unintentionally, forgetting that it was Shabbat, not knowing he could not do that on Shabbat, that person, we're going to go ahead. If he did it unintentionally, we'll allow him to bring his hand back in. The Gemara had said we had a different situation when a guy went ahead and he placed bread in an oven. And he placed the bread in the oven on Shabbat unintentionally. And the question is, when he placed the bread in the oven on Shabbat unintentionally, do we allow him to remove the bread on Shabbat? Now, what's the issue? What's the issue about moving the bread on Shabbat? The issue is that if he doesn't remove the bread, what will happen is the bread will bake. And if the bread bakes, he's in violation of the Shabbat, right? It's a violation of Shabbat, and bread breaks when the person bakes bread. Even if he bakes the bread unintentionally, forgetting that it was Shabbat, an unintentional violation of Shabbat is a sin. It's called a sin done unintentionally, and requires a korban chatat. Ralph, it looks like that. I want to show Adam the screen. That the way it's coming out on the screen, maybe I should have left it another 30 seconds to get in shape. Does it look like the way it's coming out good, or I mean the way the sound and the you tell me.
I'll let you know how it looks on YouTube.
Good here.
It's good here on your side. Okay, very good. So, if a person violates the Shabbat unintentionally, he has to bring a korban chatat, sin offering. One of those cases, if a guy goes ahead, I didn't know I couldn't bake on Shabbat. Or I know I can't bake on Shabbat. I forgot today was Shabbat. I woke up, I forgot today was Shabbat. Middle of the night, I did some sleepwalking. I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning and he put up chas v'shalom, he boiled up a pot of water. He forgot it was Shabbat. So that's called a sin offering. So the question what's the issue? The issue is there's a rabbinic prohibition to remove dough that's stuck in the wall of the oven, right? So let's say you put dough in the oven, stuck it to the wall before Shabbat. On Shabbat, I have a rabbinic prohibition of removing that dough from the oven. Why did the rabbis forbade me to remove that dough, scrape off that dough from the wall of the oven? Some say it's more like a weekday activity. Some say it's because maybe you might come to bake on Shabbat. If you allow you to go being so involved in the oven, in the wall of the oven, scraping off the wall of the oven, the dough, you might actually come to actually bake on Shabbat. So again, the rabbis created fences to protect us. So if I went ahead and had this dough on the wall before Shabbat, on the wall, I can't take it off. I have to have taken the dough off the wall of the oven, before Shabbat. But if I did not, I'm restricted. I can't handle it. I can't take it off on Shabbat. Is that clear, Adam? But here, I mistakenly put dough on the wall on Shabbat. On Shabbat, I put the dough in the oven. The oven was still hot. The oven was gonna bake that dough. It's gonna take, how long did it take to bake the dough? 2 minutes, 3 minutes? If I remove it before it reaches the level of baking, I did not violate the Shabbat. on a Torah level because I never baked. But I did a rabbinic violation by removing the dough from the wall of the oven. So will we tell the person do the rabbinic violation to prevent the biblical violation? Even though the biblical violation was unintentionally, but it's still a biblical violation. I'll prevent you from violating the Shabbat on a Torah level unintentionally. Or do we say better don't don't violate the rabbinic law of removing the dough from the oven. And you know what? If at the end of the day it's going to bake and you violate the Shabbat unintentionally, that's the price you're going to have to pay for being uncareful and putting the dough in on Shabbat, because we're not going to allow you to violate the rabbinic law to prevent this unintentional desecration of the Shabbat. That is the question of the Gemara. Bivi had this question. One of the rabbis wasn't sure if a person by mistake placed dough in the oven on Shabbat. Will we tell you, you know what? Go ahead, remove the dough to prevent the violation of Shabbat, which the Torah violation of cooking and baking on Shabbat. Or we say just leave it there, and you know what? We're not going to allow you to violate the rabbinic law of removing the dough from the oven. That's a Bivi's question. Adam, is it clear Bivi's question? And the Gemara says, the Gemara thought I could prove it from this case of extending my hand from private to public. You want to send to the group, Adam, that we're on. The Gemara thought we could prove. We've been on this Gemara. It's been a detailed Gemara. The Gemara thought you could prove it by extending your hand from private to public. In one case, it says you can move your hand back in. In one case, it says you can't move your hand back in. And the Gemara thought that maybe this would be a so the Gemara brought these two. So the Gemara says, are these? Could you? So the question is, are these comparable? Could you learn out? Now this is how Rashi was up to in the Rashi yesterday. The fact that the Gemara answers, we're not going to penalize you. The fact that the Gemara says that you could bring your hand back in. When you place your hand out unintentionally, you could bring your hand back in with the fruit. Could we learn anything about Rav Bibi's question? Meaning to say, now the Gemara brought up another point. The Gemara had another point that if you're going to tell him he can't bring his hand back in, when you say that the person can't bring his hand back in with the fruit that he extended. Now, what about the fact that if he doesn't bring his hand back in, he might go ahead and throw it might be hard for him. He might come to throw the item, the food that's in his hand, might come to throw it down. And if he throws it down, he might come to a biblical violation of Shabbat because he extended the hand from private to public. And if he throws it down because he finds it difficult, there'll be a biblical violation of Shabbat because now it went from private to public. Are we concerned about that issue? Now, if we say that we don't allow him to bring his hand back, so it seems that we're not concerned for that biblical violation because he might throw it. But if he has his hand with the fruit extended into public property, he might throw it down. And the fact that we're not concerned for the biblical violation, and we say don't bring the hand back in, the Gemara wants to say maybe we could also could you connect that to the case that we're not going to be concerned for the biblical violation of the bread also. The same way we say if the guy extends his hand out into public property, we say he can't, if he intentionally does it, he cannot bring his hand back in with the fruit, even though he might drop the fruit. Could we say we're not concerned for the guy who put the dough in the oven on Shabbat unintentionally, for the fact that he might go ahead and do we say we're not concerned if we let it bake because we're not concerned for that biblical concern of the baking on Shabbat, the same way we're not concerned for the fact that the guy might drop the food down. Are they comparable? Very good. Adam said beautifully. One is definite, one is not definite, meaning that's how Rashi answers the question. Rashi is like exactly what Adam says. When you give a guy a fine and he extends his hand out, when he put the fruit out, put his hand with the fruit over the threshold, warning, into public property, and if you tell him he cannot put his hand back in with the fruit, we don't know that he's going to violate the Shabbat. He might just keep his hand extended with the food. And even if you say, Rabbi, how long can he keep his hand? Even if he gets tired, if it drops, but that would not, the fact that if it would drop because he's tired, that's not that he threw it down. That would be like, that would not be the type of thing that would be considered that he violated the Shabbat in that type of level. But if you're going to go ahead and allow the dough to bake, he's definitely, if you're not going to allow him to remove the dough from the walls of the oven, he's definitely going to violate the Shabbat. So that's what Rashi says. You can't compare the two. The fact that we are not concerned that the guy might drop it down is not a proof that we're not going to be concerned about allowing the dough to bake. Maybe we will not allow the dough to bake because if we don't let him remove that dough, it's definitely going to violate the Shabbat. However, here when he extends his hand, it's not definite that he's going to violate the Shabbat, because maybe he will keep his hand extended. And therefore, the Gemara still has the question of Bibi. We still don't have, even if we're going to explain the two bright dough, one's intentionally, one's unintentionally, we're going to still have the question of Bibi. Do we allow the guy to remove the dough from the wall of the oven that he placed there unintentionally on Shabbat? Do we allow him to violate the rabbinic law to remove it from the oven in order to prevent the violation of the baking on Shabbat? Now, the fact Rashi also points out, the fact that the guy, when he unintentionally sticks his hand down into public property, we allow him to put his hand back. We allow that there was never a rabbinic prohibition on the books to say that you can't put your hand back when unintentionally you stuck your hand out with the food into public and putting your hand. You should not have put your hand back into public property. There's no rabbinic law on the book saying you can't put the hand back. And so we say you're not going to find the guy. He's allowed to put his hand back. If he unintentionally stuck his hand out with the food into public property, he can put his hand back. But when there is a rabbinic prohibition on the books of removing dough from the oven, which has nothing to do with the fact that the guy unintentionally put the dough in the oven on Shabbat. He put the dough in. If a guy puts dough in before Shabbat, there is a rabbinic law. You can't remove dough from an oven on Shabbat. Now he placed the dough in on Shabbat unintentionally. Now the question is, do we push away the rabbinic prohibition of removing dough from the oven on Shabbat in order to save the guy from the baking? That we don't have, and that, so we can't compare those two cases. Adam, you see the difference in the two cases? When the guy sticks the fruit out, the fruit in his hand out to public property unintentionally Shabbat, now we're going to tell him you're not allowed to remove. If you allow him to put your hand back in, we're not knocking out a rabbinic prohibition by allowing him to pull his hand back in. We have no rabbinic prohibition of a guy when he extends food on Shabbat in public property unintentionally. There is no rabbinic prohibition to pull it back in. We just never gave the guy a fine. We allow him to put it back in. But when there is a rabbinic prohibition on the books to remove dough from the wall of the oven, so now the guy unintentionally on Shabbat goes ahead and place dough in the oven on Shabbat unintentionally, maybe we're not going to allow him to move the dough. That's how Rashi. It's a complicated piece of the Gemara. It's good. You got it, Adam? You got it? It's called real complicated, very deep Gemara. So the Gemara says another answer towards the bottom of 3b and the Gemara. Both cases are b'shogeg unintentionally. We are about 4 lines from the bottom. You see that? And hacha bekansu shogeg automezi kamifugi. Do we give a fine? Sometimes if you make an allowance in a certain case, they'll come to make an allowance in another case. And sometimes we're going to be strict in one case, not because on its own merit it should be strict, but because if you allow this, then they're going to allow that. So the Gemara is saying that the two different cases are arguing, will you give the guy a fine when he unintentionally places the hand out with fruit on Shabbat, if you're not going to give him a fine, then people will think even when you place it intentionally outside, you will also be able to bring your hand back in. So that's what they're arguing. One rabbi holds that if you unintentionally put your hand out with food into public property and your hand is extended from inside to out to public, we're going to fine you not to bring your hand back in. Why not? Because if we're not going to fine you when you do it unintentionally, they'll think they'll do that when they do it intentionally. They'll also say they'll be able to put the hand back in. Sometimes you look at a case, you look at what you see. You see a guy's hand out with food, and you tell, and when the guy did it unintentionally, you say you can bring it back in. People don't always know that it was unintentionally. People will say, as long as you didn't place, say as long as you just extended your hand, you could just put it back in. But it's not true. It depends whether it's intentional or unintentional. So therefore, in order to make it clear, no one should make mistakes in this law, we're going to penalize the guy who did it unintentionally, who really should be able to put his hand back in, but because we're concerned if you allow that, people will make a mistake and think even when he intentionally extends his hand over with food, he'll also be able to put it back in. And that's what they argue. One rabbi says we have to penalize this case because we're concerned about the next case. The other rabbi says we're not concerned, so concerned. Each case, we're not concerned. The fact that you're going to allow the guy, when he extends his hand with the food unintentionally to bring his hand back in, we're not afraid they're going to make a mistake. I think when you did it intentionally, you're going to be allowed to equally pull it back in. We're not have to be afraid of it. Right, we're going to go to the second one. People will recognize the difference, and therefore there's nothing they can be concerned about. So therefore, if the guy unintentionally extends him with food, you can allow him to pull it back in. The other food. What's that?
The hand's going to be hanging all day, so it would be hard to connect the dots between the initial incident.
What the reason? What the intent or non-intent? Exactly. Very good point. You heard what Adam said. Adam said beautifully. To the onlooker, they see the guy, his hand is standing, the hand is extended, and therefore people will. It's easy for people. People see that if they see you put your hand back in, they don't know the difference. Now the Gemara says, that was end of the page. Olam lo konsu. Really, if a guy unintentionally, good morning, Nathan. If a guy unintentionally stuck his hand with food into public property, if he did it unintentionally, we should not give the guy a fine. We should allow him to bring it back in. It was unintentional. But the question is, where is he putting his hand back? Is he putting it, if he wants to put the food directly back into where he started from, or is he going to put the food into an adjacent courtyard, adjacent place? So that's what the Gemara says. If we're going to give him a fine, if to put the food, to move his hand back into an adjacent place. Let's say he's by the border, right? He's standing right here, private, and his hand was extended to public. And right next to the public, but also he has right next to him, there's another area which is more of like a different courtyard. It's not a public property. It's another courtyard. And can he go ahead and it's also private. He's in private, and the other courtyard is private. Can he go ahead and put the food down into a different private property? So the food never went into public property. So instead of going back into his private property where he is, going into a different private property. That's where he wants to suggest, that's where you're not allowed to go ahead and put the food back. Why not? Because we're afraid, because he said like this, the Gemara's going to explain, the Gemara's going to ask the question, what's the difference? If I could pull it back into my courtyard, why should I be able to pull it back to the next courtyard? The Gemara's going to answer, just give you a little preview. What the Gemara's going to say is that, the guy, when you want to remove something from, when your intention is to get this out of where I am, there's two things in life. Sometimes it's about getting it to the other place, and sometimes it's about getting it, I don't want it over here. So if I go ahead and I remove this item from here to another, I originally extended into public property, and then I moved it in, then instead, and then you say, no, you can put it back into, you allow you to put it back into another courtyard. The fact that I now don't have it where the food item originally was, I might come to similarly to put it into a public property. because my intention was I don't want this item here. I don't have room. I want it out of here. So therefore, there's a concern if you allow me to put it into some other domain, even though it's technically also private, I might come to move it into a public domain. But when I'm not getting into another domain, it's not leaving where I am. When the food is coming right back where it started from, that if you allow me to take the food where it started, coming back where it started from, we're not afraid you're going to come to allow it to go into public property because you never moved the item anywhere, didn't leave the domain where it started. We'll only allow you to bring it back so therefore the item never was placed. Now remember, we're all talking about the food was extended into that property. You never place it down. You can't take a food from public property and bring it to private property, right? We're talking about the food is extended in your hand. It never left your hand. Now can I move? But it went from private. I'm standing in private, and my hand is extended into public. Now can I just take my hand back where I am? So as long as I'm bringing it right back. Good morning, Boker Tov. Good to see you. Well, if you want to join us, you're invited. That'd be great. Every day, anytime 6:45, you come in. Anytime we take you. Make yourself comfortable. If you want, there's the copies of the Gemara in the Hebrew English over here. We have French Gemaras, whatever you want. So that's what the Gemara says. Bring it back to where you originally were. We're going to allow you, if unintentionally you extended your hand with the fruit into public, and now you want to bring it right back to you, you could do it. However, the Gemara says now we're on Mazel Tov, Mabruk. Dalet Amud Aleph, 4a. But when you put it into a different courtyard, that will be a difference. We're not going to allow you to return to throw the item or place the item in a different courtyard. So now the Gemara is going to question. And this is exactly, and this would be, if this is the interpretation of the Braita, therefore this will answer the question of Rav Nachman, of Rav Nachman. And we see that Rav Nachman's answer is in sync with what we just said. Your hand was full with fruit. You were standing in private property. And then and you place your hand outside. You're waiting for someone to take the fruit from you. And then you realize it's Shabbat. Can I return it to the courtyard that it started, where I started from? Amalei muta. You're allowed. What did the rabbi tell him? What did Rav Nachman tell Rava? Muta. You're allowed to return. You're allowed to take your hand, even though it's extended into public property. But you didn't place it down in public property. You placed your hand unintentionally. You did not know it was Shabbat. Well, you did not know I can't do that, and you placed it out. And now you place your hand out. Can I bring it back in? I can bring it back in. Now, Amalei muta. So the rabbi says muta. You're allowed to go ahead and do that. Bring it back in. So then he says, you're allowing me to go ahead and place this item into this over here. See, Rashi addresses the issue. I gave the case that, you're like on the border between the public property and another courtyard right next to me. Rashi says about throwing it into the nearby courtyard, which might be a more practical case. And I'm standing in private, public property right here, but there's another private courtyard right next adjacent, and I just throw it to my neighbor's the other courtyard, which is in front of the houses, of the other houses. So that would be a little bit more practical. How I would want. Can I throw it into the other courtyard? So the rabbi says, "Lo, I'm asur. You cannot throw this item. This item that you had, this fruit. You had an apple. You had the apples in your hand. You have the oranges in your hand. You can't throw those oranges into a different courtyard. You only can bring it back to the courtyard where you started from. So the Gemara says, "Umayshna, what's the difference?" So he told him what's the difference in the cases? If you're allowing the guy to move the item back into his own courtyard, why can't you allow him to move it back into throw it into his friend's courtyard? Adam, you hear the question? Ralph, you hear the question? If you allow the guy who puts the apple, he plays his hand with the apples, is extended into public property, and he did it unintentionally, and you allow him to bring the hand back into where he is, why don't you say that he can go ahead and throw it into an adjacent, private, another courtyard, private property, it's similar to his private property. Say it again? And it's right. Thrown to a side courtyard, correct. But it's not like it went from, but it was never placed in public property. It was just extended. So it's not that it's actually going from public to private actually, because it was never placed into public property. It's in the air over public property, not placed in public property. And right, why can't you just throw it into the same way you allow him to bring his hand back where he is, and he's going to, that means the hand's going from that public area, that public space, call it air, whatever, to where he is. So that why can't you allow him to go from that public place into the court and bring it into the, either just put it into the courtyard, or like I said, or just throw it into the courtyard. What's, I don't know that there should be a difference. You see, the fact that it's, that it never landed in public property would seem to me, but it's a good point. The question is, but it's not going from public because it was never resting in public. That's what I would think, right? Private to private should be able to do it as long as, let's say, there might be some Eruv issues. If this courtyard is because that courtyard, you might have to do something to unite the courtyards to make them like one courtyard. But that might be, if not, there might be issues, because the courtyard might be more of a place of those residents, and it's more like their, it's for their use, and maybe if it's not for my use, meaning let's give an example. The lobbies in a building, right? Take the lobbies in a building. Let's say if you have a building, let's say we have many people own apartments in a building. An apartment building, right? Condos. You own an apartment, we all own apartments. But the lobbies, the hallways is a shared space. Your apartment is your space. The hallway, everybody uses. The fact that the hallway, all the members of the buildings use the hallway, there's a concern, and in the old days, it wasn't apartment buildings. In the old days, it was a courtyard in front of the houses. You had your house, remind me your name? Michael had his house, Adam had his house, I had my house. We all had our own private house, where we eat, every house has a mitzvah to light a menorah, right? We all had a private house. But then we had a space in front of the house that was a courtyard that I would carry into, and you would carry into. Michael and Adam, we would do things in that courtyard. So the rabbi said, morning, Nathan, you can't carry from your house into that courtyard on Shabbat. No member could carry from the house rabbinically into that courtyard unless you make some sort of eruv, that they give food from each, they do something from each house, they give some sort of food to each house, and they put it into one house, eruv chatzerot, like Nathan said, to make their courtyard like it's one, belongs to one. It's not that it's, because what's the issue? Remember, the perception is a very big thing. How people perceive things and the concern the rabbis are here to protect. If you're going to go ahead and just carry from your house into the courtyard, which is a shared space, so it's like a semi-public space in a certain sense. It's not private, but it's not public for the world, but it's public for all of us. So the fact that we're all using this space, and I carry from my house to this public area in front of our house, it's like a semi-public, whatever, semi-private. I might come to carry from my house to where? Adam, what's the next possibility?
Oh.
The real public place. Because listen, I'm carrying from my house into this area where my neighbor also uses, and my other neighbor uses. We're all sharing this like in a certain, I might come to
Step on the street.
step on the street. I might make that mistake. Right. Right. So there's two issues, Adam. You know, if the courtyard is adjacent to public property, there's a concern I might just walk into the public property because I might not I'm so close to the public property. Therefore, we put up some sort of string or something to show this is private. So therefore, you remember that this is separate. That's going to serve as a sign to you. I can't go past this area. But nevertheless, I might come to. That reminds me, but I might come to carry into public property because I look at this area in front of my house like a public property. I might just walk straight into public property. I say the same way I could carry from here to there, I could carry it here into public property. So by collecting the food and putting it from everybody, putting it to one house, makes it's like they're all part of that one house. And it makes like the whole area, the courtyard is also more like a private area. So that serves for that purpose. So therefore, so sometimes when you have a courtyard, and therefore that's why when people own apartments in a building, therefore that also becomes an issue because that lobby space, the hallway space is just like the courtyard. So
Is that what people do when they share a sukkah in the backyard of the building? They make it all
right.
shared.
So that therefore, if it's right, they have to figure out how to make this Erev Chatzerot, how to do this right. If you're in a hotel, so or if you're let's say in a place, let's say like a dorm building of a college, so there, if the college owns, if an item in each, or the motel, the hotel, or you rent your room, but they have items in each and every room belongs to them. Right, the owner of the building has a refrigerator in every apartment, or there's stuff that belongs to them. So therefore, that makes it all one. So therefore, you will need technically in such a place. Let's say you might not need any area, but in a place where everybody, this is your private place, and everything here is, or even if you rent, everything belongs to you, and nothing. There's not one person that has something in each and every apartment. Then you get into those issues, So now, so the Gemara says, Umayshna. So he asked the rabbi, what is the difference between this case and the other case? What's the difference between, so what's the difference between, so you have to look into those questions when you're living in a building, and you own an apartment in a building, and or you're renting an apartment in a building. These are questions that people have to ask about going from the apartment to, does the owner of the building have stuff in each and every apartment? When you're renting an apartment, sometimes every apartment he has a refrigerator, provide something that makes it all like his. Then it's like one owner there. So the Gemara says the rabbi told him back. The rabbi gave like a joke. Sometimes you'll see some humor in the Gemara. When you measure a core of salt for me, when you do such a job for me, which is a big job, I'll give you reward. I'll give you the answer. He was joking with the person. Obviously, we have to know what the deeper meaning of this joke. Why is your salt? Salt maybe gives taste to a food. You're trying to understand the reason, the taste, right? That's the taste. You taste the item. You understand. You feel it. So he tells him, when you go ahead, when you measure a core of a certain amount of salt for me, I will go ahead and answer your question. And then he says, you know what the answer is? Hatam lo avida machshavto, hacha avida machshavto. Over there, when you or over here, sorry, in the case when you put the item, like we said, if I go ahead and I stand in my hand with the fruit into public, and I go ahead and I pull it back in, my intention was never fulfilled. I never got the item out from where I wanted it. What was my intention by extending my hand with the fruit into public property? I wanted to get the item out of here. I didn't want it. I don't want it here. So if you allow me to go in and bring it back in, so okay, you allow me to bring it back in. There's not a concern. But if if I go in and I stuck my hand out with the fruit into public property, and you allow me to throw it into a different courtyard, then my machshava, my intention of removing the item from this place was fulfilled, and we're concerned, I might go ahead and actually put it into what? Into real public property. So therefore, if the guy extended the hand into public property unintentionally with food, we're not going to allow him to throw it into a different courtyard, but we're going to allow him to pull it back into the courtyard that he was in. And then the Gemara, which we're going to focus on tomorrow, which we're going to start the Gemara just now, a little preview, is the Gemara is going to analyze this question that we had from Rav Bivi. Gufa. Boy Rav Bivi Baravai. Now we're going back to the question that we had before. Hitbik pat betanor. If the guy went ahead and hitbik is the vik, he attached. You know, everybody knows where the word hitbik from Lashon. The Torah says v'dafku bo. You have to attach yourself to God. Here they attach the dough to the wall of the oven. But there's a mitzvah to attach yourself to God. What does the Gemara say? How can you attach yourself to God? The Gemara says if you attach yourself to the Torah scholar, there's a mitzvah in the Torah. One of the 613 mitzvot is to attach yourself to a Torah scholar. And the Rambam says, do business with the rabbi. He doesn't have to be a rabbi, official rabbi. He's a learned, very learned person. Do business with him, sit with him, eat with him, drink with him. The more you connect with the Torah scholar, obviously you're going to learn from him. Like I always say, you go to a wedding, right? And let's say it's open, now it's much more open seating than ever before. I don't know if you noticed that they're moving away from place cards, a lot of places now. You just say family, friends, friends of the groom, friends of the kala, right? And you could pick the seat where you're going to sit. So, and you see a rabbi sitting by himself or whatever it is, you can sit next to him. No one's forbidding it. It's not like it's a rabbi stand, all the rabbis are there, feel uncomfortable. You could sit there, you have an opportunity to sit next to him and talk with him. Now, what do you think he's going to be talking about? Did the Yankees win last night? The Met trade, the new trade, they trade the catcher? Are they going to be talking, someone's talking about the trading of a catcher, the Mets, the Yankees. I don't think he's going to be talking about that. He's going to be talking about, most probably he'll talk something. Maybe he'll talk about that. He'll talk about certain things, but he'll also talk about hopefully some Torah. Bring some Torah to the table, something that you'll learn from. That's the dafku. That's you attach yourself to the Torah scholar. I want to wish everyone a beautiful day, and we'll be back tomorrow. Thank you for joining, Michael. Monday through Friday, any day, to 6:45 and 7:25. You are cordially invited. On Wednesday, yes. What would people want? It's up to what I would. Right, either 7:45 or 7:45, whatever the people want. Before the 7:30 minute, before the 8:30. What it take? Oh, whatever. But as long as people could come. No, 6:45 works for you, both of you. Ralph, earlier works for Ralph too, I bet.
What's that?
For Wednesday, tomorrow regular time. Could Wednesday 6:45 work for you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Take it. Bye-bye.